High school life can be rough for a variety of different reasons, and one thing that certainly doesn't help things is the bizarre rotating block schedule. In middle school, your schedule would practically be the same every day, so learning it was really simple. In contrast, the rotating blocks of high school can really throw you off and confuse you if you're not prepared. Just looking at your schedule for the first time may intimidate you a bit. There are different classes all over the place and it all seems random. However, the truth is that every schedule operates under the exact same pattern, and I'm going to explain that pattern to you, as well as give you a few tips that I've picked up on over my high school career. With the help of this video, you'll be able to learn your schedule well enough to know exactly where you're going every day without even glancing at it. Now, this video is mostly aimed at incoming freshmen, but some sophomores, juniors, and even seniors can benefit from these tips as well. With the introduction finished, let's just dive right into it. If you have it, I'd like you to take out the paper copy of your schedule and follow along. It should look a little something like this. Weird, isn't it? Now, I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to quickly explain how to read it. Up here, we have the days that we rotate through. Day 4, Day 3, Day 2, and Day 1. On the side, you have labels for blocks 1 through 6. Each day, you just have to go through the blocks from top to bottom. The year starts on Day 4, so you just look at the Day 4 column only and go to the classes listed in all those cells. The next day would be a Day 3, so you would then go down that column and go to all those classes. The 2 days after that, you would use the Day 2 and Day 1 columns respectively. After Day 1, the schedule cycles back to Day 4, so you just do it all over again. Simple enough, right? Now, you may be asking yourself, why on earth do the days count down from 4 instead of up from 1? And to answer that question, I have not even a clue. Now we know how to read the schedule, but the point of this video is so you can learn it so you don't have to read it. So let's move on to that. The key to learning your schedule is understanding your schedule. Just looking at your schedule, you may have noticed that some classes seem to move diagonally downwards as you go through the days. That's because that class is rotating, hence why it's called the rotating block schedule. The truth is that even though it may not look like it, every single class rotates in this way. For me to explain further, you have to understand what I call the two halves. See, the truth is that your schedule is actually divided into two halves that each rotate. If you look at the first 3 blocks of your schedule, you should notice that you only have 4 different classes during those blocks across all 4 days. Similarly, there are 4 classes that you only ever have during the last 3 blocks. For simplicity, I'm going to call these your first half classes and your second half classes, respectively. Now that we realize this explanation will be very simple. Let's ignore the second half for now and only focus on the first. Starting from Day 4, you have 3 classes that go in a particular order and 1 that you don't have at all. We'll consider this class rotated out. Now watch what happens when we move on to Day 3. The class that was rotated out rotates back in through the first block. This causes the other 3 classes to move down a block, but since there's only room for 3 classes, the class that was last has to rotate out. Going from Day 3 to Day 2, the same process follows. The class that was rotated out rotates back on top, the next 2 classes move down, and the last class rotates out. This same process happens from Day 2 to Day 1, and even from Day 1 back to Day 4, which means you never have to worry about resetting the pattern. It just keeps going. Now, the second half follows an identical process, except that it uses blocks 4, 5, and 6 instead of 1, 2, and 3. That's all. Once you understand this, learning your schedule is just a matter of knowing the orders of the classes in your first and second halves, which in total isn't any harder than memorizing your phone number. The only tricky part is remembering to switch between the first and second half after block 3 every day. If you're a freshman, there's a good chance that you have first lunch every day, which means your halves are conveniently separated by lunch, and this should make things even easier to manage. Speaking of lunch, this is an important topic to explain. But before that, I need to tell you guys something important about the day rotations. They are set in stone, so they will never change. This means that even if school is canceled because of a snowstorm, a hurricane, or a spontaneous volcanic eruption, that it still counts as a day in the rotation. So if school is canceled on what would have been a Day 2, the next day, when we return, it would still be a Day 1, not a Day 2. Nothing changes. Now, you probably heard me mention a first lunch a few seconds ago. There are actually two different lunch periods, first lunch and second lunch, and which one you have can vary. At the bottom of every second half class for all 4 days, you should see a label that says lunch before or lunch after, in addition to a B or A next to the teacher's name, which stands for before or after. But how does one determine which of these you look at, you may ask? Ignore everything except for block 4. On any given day, if your fourth block class says lunch before, that means you go to lunch right before that class. We call that first lunch. Similarly, if your fourth block class says lunch after, you go to lunch right after that class, and we call this second lunch. As I briefly mentioned earlier, this school is usually pretty good about making sure that freshmen have first lunch, so you may not need to worry about this now, but this will be useful to know next year when a lot of you will have varying lunches. Now we're going to talk about lab days, which is quite a treat. After a couple of weeks, you'll start to have lab periods for your science classes. This means that instead of going to PE, or in rare cases a study hall, you will instead head to your science classroom to do some type of experiment. Now, normally this would just be a matter of going to biology, for instance, instead of gym, but for some reason you can't have 2 labs in 1 week. Since there are 5 days in a full school week but only 4 days in the rotation, you'll rarely have a lab scheduled for both Monday and Friday of a week. In this case, you just have to go to the lab on the Friday, and on the Monday you go to gym. You should always assume you need to go to lab unless it's a Monday, and even then only during full 5-day weeks. Unfortunately, there's another issue complicating things. Science teachers often share rooms, which means that your class will need to go to a different room, which we call a bump out room, on a different class's lab days. This means that there's a day of the rotating schedule when you need to go to a different room for science. But once again, you ignore that and go to your regular science room if it's a Monday of a full week. This may sound complicated, but here's a chart that may help you understand. Know which of the 4 days is your lab day and which is the bump out day, and by default, go to lab or the bump out room respectively. Only worry about not doing that if it's a Monday of a full school week. Okay guys, that's all. With just this information, you could do a fine job of going where you should every day. However, I'm going to give you a few tips relating to your schedule that are sure to help you do an even better job at staying organized. And even if you didn't understand a lick of what I was just talking about, these tips can still help you out. Because of how the schedule rotates, any class that you have at the end of a half, i.e. the classes you have third and sixth block, you will not have the following day. You can make this work in your favor. If you have homework for one of those classes, you know you won't have to worry about doing it until the day after. Now, I'm not encouraging procrastination, but I'm just saying you could use the extra time to better manage your workflow. On the other side of the coin, if you don't have a class at the end of a half, you will have it the next day, so you should prioritize doing any work that's due for those classes. You probably already figured out that you have 2 classes rotated out every day, one for each half. But did you know that the 2 classes that are rotated out on a given day actually correspond to each other? Every single day, those 2 classes will be in the same place in their respective halves. For instance, if my statistics and English classes correspond, and I have statistics in the middle of the first half, block 2, then I'll have English in the middle of the second half, block 5. The classes correspond this way all 4 days, and every class corresponds to one other class. This means that if it makes things easier for you, you don't even need to learn the orders of both halves. Just learn the first half and know which classes correspond to those. This attribute can also be used to manage your workflow. For instance, if a certain class corresponds to your study hall, you can relegate all the work from that class to your study hall. Remember, the better you understand your schedule, the better you can manage your time around it. You've heard me talk a lot about blocks, and you may be wondering whatever happens calling them periods. Actually, periods still exist, but they mean something else now. Blocks correspond to a time frame during each school day, and their order never changes. In contrast, periods correspond to specific classes, and their order rotates with the classes. For example, if history is my 6th period class, then I will never have any class besides history during 6th period. But when I have 6th period will change. Sometimes I won't even have it at all. The truth is that periods don't really matter, but there are times when you may want to determine which period a class is, like if you need to write it on a Scantron. In those cases, there are two methods you could use to figure it out. Method 1 is to find out where it is on your day 1 schedule. You'd count off your periods in order. Block 1 is period 1, block 2 is period 2, block 3 is period 3, and then the class that's rotated out in the first half is period 4. Block 4 is period 5, block 5 is period 6, block 6 is period 7, and then the last class that's rotated out in your second half is period 8. Notice how corresponding classes differ by 4 periods. On your schedule, they are only 3 blocks apart, but the class that's rotated out still counts as a period. Method 2 is a bit faster. For classes in your first half, just take the number of the day you have the class first blocked, and that's its period number. For instance, if I'm wondering what period I have PE, I can look and see that I have PE first block on day 2, so it's my second period class. For the second half, you do the same thing for the start of that half, i.e. fourth block, but you add 4 to the number you get. If I have Spanish fourth block on day 3, 3 plus 4 is 7, so Spanish is my 7th period class. If neither method clicks with you, don't worry about it. If you really need to know, just ask your teacher and you should end up fine. This video probably overwhelmed you a bit on the first watch, so you may be wondering why the school would go through the trouble of enforcing this crazy schedule. I can't say for certain, but according to a document I came across on the school website once, this schedule increases the amount of time you spend in each class by the end of the year. This makes sense. There are fewer classes each day, so there's less time spent on transitioning between them. Classes used to be 40 minutes long, and now they're 55, so every 4 days you spend an extra 5 minutes in each class. That may seem like nothing, but there are 45 rotations during the school year, so by the end of the year you spend an extra 3 hours and 45 minutes in each class. Across all 8 classes, that's almost 27 extra hours of class time. This may seem like a bum deal, but the day you get away from each class does miracles on lightening your workload, so in the end, it's really a win-win for everyone. So you've done it. You now have at least some idea of how your schedule works, and hopefully you're at least a little less confused than you were coming in. However, please know that nobody is expecting you to navigate around school perfectly from the very first day, least of all me. Don't be afraid to look at your schedule as much as you need to, especially when you're first settling into the school. If you have any questions at all, you can ask me or ask a teacher or guidance counselor. I still remember my transition into high school, and I want nothing more than for yours to be as smooth as possible.